from Heather and me. But I see a lot of familiar faces, so it's good to see those of you who I do know, and welcome to those of you who are new to, at least new to me. And thanks for joining us. I'm Patrick Serfass. As you can see, I'm Executive Director of the American Biogas Council, and we are really excited to share with you our data from 2024. We've been building a database over the last year and a half or so, and some of you may have seen us share our news from 2023 last year, although it was not quite as organized and not quite as voluminous as we're going to share with you. This won't be a long presentation, but we do have a lot of new data that we're really excited to share. A lot of it's actually new to us too. The biogas industry is changing very quickly, as you'll see, and so we are also excited to see what's happened over the last year. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get going right into the meat and potatoes of what we're covering here. This is our report in 2025 on 2024 data. And for those of you who don't know, the American Biogas Council is the trade association for the entire biogas industry in the US. We're the only one who covers all of that. We're proud of the diversity in our members, about 400 organizations and 6,000 people that call themselves ABC members, and we exist to grow the biogas industry, which basically means maximizing the amount of organic material that is recycled and turned into energy and natural fertilizers. And that is where we all start. And so just in case biogas systems are new to you, this is why we exist, to recycle all this material. We are not an industry that primarily exists to just make energy. There are lots of other industries that just make energy. Energy is actually a byproduct of what biogas systems do, and it's where most of the revenue is generated from for these projects. But this is why it exists. There's only two ways to recycle all this organic material. You can see food waste at the top, you can see wastewater sludge on the right, and you can see a manure scraper and a dairy barn on the bottom there. Only two ways to recycle this material, and that's compost systems and biogas systems. We're going to talk to you about the biogas systems, but we love compost systems and use them also. A lot of the biogas systems compost their material after they digest it. So this is what we're looking at here. We are looking at basically a tank, or in the case of a landfill, a pile of organic material. And if you starve it of oxygen, microbes that don't like oxygen but eat up the organic material and burp out biogas, they will naturally reproduce. And that's what we're doing. We're creating an environment where those microbes can go to work and eat up all the organic material, make biogas. And when you're done, you have the same nutrients that you started with, your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And so if you are not in a landfill and you're at a tanked digester, you also produce digested material, which can be used to displace synthetic fertilizers. If you need any photos for your story, we have a Flickr page that's on our website. Everything there is fair game. Just cite the American Biogas Council. All right, so here's where we are today. We have almost 2,500 biogas systems operating in the United States. Just shy of 600 of those are using their biogas to produce RNG. That's renewable natural gas, which basically means pipeline quality gas. You really can't tell a renewable natural gas molecule from a conventional natural gas molecule, except for one's been renewably produced. And a little bit less than 1,500 electricity projects. You'll see them on farms, you'll see them at wastewater plants, you'll see food scrap only systems, and you'll see them at landfills. And the dots on the map to the right there show you where they are. There's biogas systems in all 50 states. Why? Because there are people and animals in all 50 states, or at least one of the two. And the people produce waste, whether it's your human manure or the food waste that we produce, or and then the animals, same thing. So we want to recycle all that organic material. If we recycled all of it, we would be building an additional 24,000 systems. So you can basically consider the US biogas industry about 10% built out. Most of the opportunity is left for us. So I'm going to cover a couple things for you here. We've got maybe about 10 slides or so with some data, but here's some of the high points. 2,500 facilities now, 125 new ones, and 13% increase in biogas output capacity. So the growth from 23 to 24 compared to the growth from 24 until now. We are seeing an acceleration of growth of new facilities, an acceleration of growth of 17%, and acceleration of growth in the biogas capacity as well of 13%. And likewise, an acceleration of growth in the investment that we're seeing as well. So here's, you can see the growth of the industry. This is all biogas facilities in the US, and the dark bar on top shows the new systems that went into operation each year. So if you look over the last 4 years or so, you're looking at about 100, even the last 5 years, you're looking at about 100 new projects a year that we've been adding. But if you look at last year, you can see that we had a record-breaking year. And that's one of the biggest headlines for 2024 was most growth ever for the industry. 125 new facilities and 17% more new facilities than the 107 that came online last year. If you look at the total number of facilities, so our 2,500 facilities, if you look at it by feedstock, the amount of material that's coming into the biogas systems, you'll see the wastewater facilities actually dominate the number of facilities. That's where most of them are. The main change for 2024 is that this is the first year that the farm-based projects or agricultural projects exceed the number of landfill projects. And so they come into number 2 from number 3 for the farm-based projects. And you can see, if you look at the year-on-year growth, you can see that the growth of landfill systems actually did shrink. We had less growth in landfill in 2024 than we did in 2023, but overall still a lot of growth. And we'll show you a little bit more about that coming up. And then just an exceptional acceleration of growth for agriculture and wastewater facilities. We're still building the food waste only systems, and those are a little bit more complex systems than the others, but there are a lot of people in our industry who are pretty bullish that the food waste systems will actually see much more significant growth in the coming years. Let's look at capital investment. So this is the amount, like the cost of all the projects, the capital expenses of each project. And you can see that most of the investment across what happened new in 2024 was in landfill and agriculture. That's where most of the growth happened. Almost $1.5 billion of new projects came online in 2024 for farm-based projects and landfill projects. And if you look at it over all time, you can see that picture shifts. Not surprisingly, the wastewater sector is the highest. They have almost half the facilities. But landfill investment there is super significant as well, about $14 billion and $15 billion for wastewater, followed by farm and food waste. A lot of our members like to look at, okay, well, that's overall, that's gross investment, but how much does it cost per unit of energy that you're producing? Because the different systems produce different amounts of energy. So not surprisingly, landfill systems are the cheapest. You don't have to build the tanks. You don't have to build the pre-processing. You're dumping garbage in a pile and then putting daily cover or alternate daily cover over it. The other systems, which are anaerobic digesters, are more expensive. And you can see that the wastewater projects are the most expensive. But I think that's a little bit misleading, because I think that some of our data for the wastewater facilities, when people give us their capital expenses, they're counting more than just the biogas system, more than just the digester. A lot of times at a municipality, you're getting approval to spend money on the biogas system and other things. So I think that number is actually artificially inflated. But we see that both farm-based systems and food waste systems are pretty competitive with each other, with food waste just being slightly more expensive per unit of energy. If we look at the output of the systems, we're going to look at power versus RNG. These are the two main things that the biogas is used for. It can also be used as heat, but that's certainly in the minority at most facilities. You can see that last year, around 2023, we had about 35% of the projects, or the biogas output rather, was producing RNG, and that share has certainly been growing over time, and now it's just over 40%. 40% of the gas is going to RNG. That means you're taking the biogas, which is basically a mixture of methane and carbon dioxide. You're taking the carbon dioxide out, leaving mostly pure methane, and then that can be injected into a gas pipeline and used just the way that natural gas is. You make electricity from it, put it in vehicles, whatever you want to use it at home, use it in businesses, whatever you want to use it for. That's the growing share of the industry. But still, the lion's share of biogas is being used to produce power. The flaring line in there, which only represents 1% of the biogas that's being produced, is there are some facilities that, especially the really old ones, we have biogas facilities that are now 100 years old and still operating. They were built in the 1920s. And some of those facilities, not those oldest ones actually in particular, but a lot of the older facilities that are decades old, they weren't built with the idea of selling their energy for anything. They just wanted to reduce the amount of organic material that they had to manage. And when you put it in a biogas system, the organic volume of material basically gets cut in half. And so that's a huge benefit if you have to pay something to deal with all that. So some facilities are just flaring all or most of their gas, and that 1% represents the facilities that are flaring all or most of their gas, even though they have a biogas system. So mostly happens at wastewater facilities, but obviously a small percentage. And you can actually see it's been shrinking over time as well as people realize, hey, I can do something with this gas, something useful environmentally and economically with it. If we continue to look at power versus RNG, you can see just what we were just looking at, which is a split of RNG projects versus power projects. We were just looking at biogas output, and now we're looking at projects. Over 3/4 of projects are producing power in the biogas industry. But if you look at the chart on the right, which is just what happened new in 2024, you can see that clearly the attention of the industry is focused on building new RNG projects. That's mostly due to the economics of those projects. It's easier to sell your gas as renewable natural gas than it is as renewable electricity right now. And so 95% of new projects last year were RNG projects. If we just look at those RNG projects, because it was such a growing sector and such an important sector for new projects, and we look at the capacity of just RNG projects, the industry is producing about 160 trillion BTUs of energy every year. And most of that is coming from the landfill sector. So while the landfill sector is now number 3 in terms of the number of projects, the amount of gas produced by the landfills, because they produce so much more gas, is actually really high. Almost 3/4 of all gas, certainly 2/3 would be a little bit more accurate. 2/3 of all gas is coming from the landfill gas space, compared to 1/4 coming from our farm-based systems. And if we continue looking at just the RNG sector of the entire biogas industry, and just look as a snapshot to see how things have changed over time, we look at 2020 on the left versus 2024. If you look at the total that's inside those rings there, you can see that there's been 170% growth of RNG production over the last 4 years, which is obviously massive. And you can see that more visually here. If you look at it over time, you can see the wedges that are growing are the dark blue ones, which is the landfill sector, and then the dark green sector, which is our farm-based, our agriculture systems. So RNG capacity is certainly increasing overall, largely mostly due to landfill and agriculture. Although if you look, the food waste systems are increasing as well, and less so, but wastewater facilities, there are more RNG facilities coming out. And again, that's just due to the economics today that we have in terms of how much more revenue you can produce by selling your biogas as RNG versus the revenue that you can produce selling your biogas as renewable electricity or heat. If we just look, I've just got a couple left here. Just look at the sectors from our feedstock sectors here individually, just give you a few snapshots in case you happen to be more interested in these subsectors of the industry. This is where we are with wastewater. There's much more even distribution than we had seen in the last couple of years. So basically, you're looking at the size of facilities here. So the smallest wastewater facilities on the left, 1 to 9 million gallons per day. That's what the MGD is. The largest facilities is the second to last chart on the right there, and that's greater than 100 MGD. I'm in Washington, D.C. We have one of the largest wastewater facilities in the world. It's 400 MGD, and they would fall into that last category. But we're still doing a lot of work. There's about 1,800 facilities that we don't know how big they are, where we haven't confirmed their size yet. And so we're still tracking down that information. So you can look at this as biogas systems work at most sizes of wastewater facilities above 1 million gallons a day. And you can also see that there's a lot of opportunity for new projects in the wastewater sector to take that sludge that you're pulling out of sewage and extract the energy out of it so that you don't have to send it to landfill, and then use that digested material and replace synthetic fertilizers with it and grow crops and other things. If we look at just the farm sector here, here's a snapshot of the types of farms where biogas systems exist. This is all biogas systems. So that basically 600 farm-based systems, 86% of those are on dairies. That's for a few reasons. Dairy cows produce a lot of manure, about 120 to 150 pounds of manure every day. I like to say that every full-size dairy cow produces a person of poop, and basically a full person's body weight of manure every day. That's a lot of manure, and that's a lot to recycle, and you can create energy from that. And so as a waste management tool, recycling tool, and renewable energy tool, dairy certainly has an edge. But the swine industry and poultry industry are catching on and building more and more biogas systems now. And so I expect those sectors to grow quite a bit over the next several years as those projects are taking off. And then if we look at the food waste systems, this is first a look at all food waste. So about 66 million tons per year of food waste, according to the EPA. If we add up all the organic material that is being recycled, so remember, two ways to recycle organic material: compost systems and biogas systems. If you add up all those biogas systems that are just recycling food waste, and you add the compost systems, there's about 14% of our post-consumer food waste in the US that's actually being recycled. What an opportunity to expand that, build more systems, biogas systems and compost systems alike. And if you look at the biogas systems that are just recycling food waste, you can see that the yellow slice here and the dark blue slice, these are both pre-consumer. The green slice is post-consumer. And so the preference is certainly to recycle pre-consumer waste if you're a standalone food waste facility. And that mostly has to do with the fact that the food waste is a little bit more consistent before it reaches a consumer, and you also have much less contamination that you have to deal with. Think about like when we throw a tray of food away at a restaurant or like at a food hall, there's all kinds of other things that are probably not food waste that gets thrown in there that need to be filtered out. So the facilities generally prefer pre-consumer if you can get to it, but we can handle it all. You just need to add more equipment to clean it up first. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Heather, who leads our entire policy program, to give you a sense of what's really driving the industry and where we are right now.
Thanks, Patrick. So as Patrick noted at the top of the call, organic waste is everywhere. This is not an urban or rural or red or blue issue. Whether you're in a city and you're dealing with human waste and food waste, or you're in rural communities and you're dealing with, ag and food processing material, this is nationwide. And so this is a result of our election in November, and it just shows an overlay of all of the projects that are operational that Patrick just went over sort of the congressional districts of the 119th Congress. And so you can see certainly where the density of projects exist across the nation, but also that those do not know political boundaries. And so this is a really rare bipartisan issue, potentially, especially when we talk about federal policy or here shortly. But we see a lot of interest, not only in things like recycling and emission control from managing waste differently, but also the economic benefits and the revenue potential of managing waste differently. And so we'll get into a little bit of that here in the policy slides. So next slide, Patrick. So the way we look at policy around biogas systems is how do we create incentives that build the recycling centers. So as Patrick noted, we have a very diverse membership. And what that means is the common ground for us as an organization, and when we think about policy, is how do we get waste into the systems where we can extract all of that value? Yes, energy, but also a bunch of other commodities and revenue opportunities. So these are policies that we look at that encourage the biogas to be captured. We focus on growing market demand. So really looking at diverting that waste out of landfills into more fruitful endeavors where we can produce commodities and fertilizers and energy out of that waste. So organics diversion policies is something we're focused on. If you look downstream at what we can do with the energy coming out of those systems, it turns into heating fuels, energy for industrial and manufacturing processes. It can be fuels for vehicles, whether electric or non-electric. So clean heat, which is essentially all of the thermal uses for biogas, and then the fuel, which is transportation typically. We also still do a lot with electricity, as Patrick noted. So base load, or what we call 24/7 electricity, is a really unique feature of biogas to electricity systems. And it is something that we see a lot more frequently in policy conversations around renewable electricity. How do we get to renewable and get further toward our energy goals while also making sure that we have reliable 24/7 power? So biogas fits that niche very well. And so we are advocating for more incentives that really reward things like biogas and others like hydro that are 24/7, right? And then any other programs that essentially are growing market demand. That could be things that use hydrogen or others that we'll talk about here briefly. The other is voluntary markets. So we know that corporates and other programs, whether that be driven by supply chain here domestically or internationally, we know people are still committing, absent any policy mandates, to lower carbon products, whether that's fertilizers, whether that's energy. We know that voluntary markets are driving a lot of investment in this industry. And so anything that we can do to support those voluntary buyers in their endeavor to buy RNG and biogas and other derived fuels is something we're working on. That includes standardized and very transparent carbon and emission-based policies. That includes any thermal incentives that we can offer to buildings, think about university campuses, et cetera, to help decarbonize. And also anything around life cycle emissions. So there's a lot of emission benefits coming from these systems when we're recycling waste differently. The benefits are articulated very clearly in life cycle emission accounting, but that science has to continue to be brought into public policy. And so we are advocating for robust life cycle assessments to be considered as well. And then Patrick mentioned the innovation that our industry is working towards. So things like commercial CO2 production, domestic fertilizer production. We also have folks doing commercial compost and biochar on the back end of these biogas systems. So the biogas systems themselves are, yes, capturing gas, but they're also a great funnel for all of these other manufacturing and commodity production opportunities. And so how do we encourage that? Not only for the revenue stack to get these projects moving, but also for domestic economic growth. And then the last is, how do we grow the supply? How do we grow what is being produced in terms of the actual fuel? And so that is really on the financial side. How do we give a leg up to the producers out there building these facilities and putting infrastructure and steel in the ground? So next slide, Patrick. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but for those who might be policy nerds, we wanted to put this here just as a reference of what policies we see ahead of us, certainly in 2025, but possibly through this next administration and next Congress. These are sort of front and center for us as ABC as we look to identify policies that fit in all of those buckets that we just mentioned. So EPA's renewable fuel standard fits in our demand growth category. Tailpipe rules, again, demand growth. How do we get RNG into CNG vehicles to cost effectively decarbonize our heavy transport sector? Dispensing infrastructure, again, how do we incentivize getting these fuels into vehicles? We already talked about organics waste diversion. DOE's net zero buildings. So we have an opportunity to revisit that and really talk about robust life cycle value when it comes to emission reductions and how can we achieve net zero buildings when we look at the entire life cycle of fuels and the energy profile of buildings. I mentioned 24/7 electricity. We have a huge opportunity to serve the growing demand in the country. And so we're eager to work on policies that adequately recognize the role biogas plays. Patrick, one last slide. Tax policy. So front of mind, I know for a lot, especially those that might be in DC, we have a ton of opportunity with tax credits. It's something that will be front of mind in our policy work for this year. And because we touch so many facets of the energy sector, we're really looking to try and preserve and amplify what tax policy can do. But that is production tax credits, investment tax credits for RNG and electricity, but also the end uses in fuel, end uses as hydrogen production, sustainable aviation fuels, all of the places that biogas can go. We want to make sure that that's visible to our policymakers. And then the last is helping farmers. So those producing fertilizer, those putting these systems on ag land, leveraging things like grants and loan guarantees through programs like USDA and the REAP programs, making sure that those continue to be part of our agricultural policy moving forward. So that's what's ahead of us. That's the very short version. So I'll turn it back over to Patrick.
Thanks, Heather. And we're just going to end there. I'm just going to let you know that the biggest trade show for the biogas industry in North America is coming up at the end of April in Denver. So if you want to get engaged more, it's a great place to learn a ton and get a ton of new information. We're going to have new data that we're actually sharing here, probably on the potential for the industry and some other things. And with that, we're going to open up for questions. I'm going to leave Melissa's information here, our Director of Communications, who put this all together, and also invite Ian to join us in answering any of your questions. All of the data that you saw today has been his work. He leads our data and analysis team. And so thank you very much for listening. All right, just a minute.